name is Melanie Moon, and I am continuing the reading of the book Race in the City, which was a compilation of essays written for Cincinnati's bicentennial in 1988. The book was published in 1993. It was edited by Henry Louis Taylor, Jr., and I'm reading Chapter 2, which was written by William Cheek and Aimee Lee Cheek. It is entitled John Mercer Langston and the Cincinnati Riot of 1841. A multifaceted leader whose career in black protest, politics, education, and the law spanned half a century, John Mercer Langston, December 14, 1829 to November 15, 1897, was in the vanguard of the 19th century African American struggle. Educated at Oberlin College, A.B. 1849, Seminary 1853, Langston managed to gain admittance to the previously all-white Ohio bar in 1854. The next year, his election as clerk of Brownhelm, a township not far from Oberlin, made him the first African American elected to public office in the United States. During his subsequent 15-year residence in Oberlin, he solidified his reputation as an able public executive and adroit defense attorney. Throughout the 1850s, Langston played a major role in both the strong black civil rights movement in Ohio and radical anti-slavery politics. In 1863, once the North finally agreed to accept black soldiers, he threw himself into black recruitment, directing recruiting efforts in the Midwest for the pioneering 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments. He then became the head of recruiting for the first black regiment in Ohio. The National Black Convention in Syracuse in October 1864 recognized Langston's contributions by naming him president of its newly formed National Equal Rights League. After the Civil War, Langston took a leading role in Reconstruction as an inspector for the Freedmen's Bureau and an organizer for the Republican Party in the South. He was the first law dean of Howard University and a member of the Washington, D.C. Board of Health. After serving as the U.S. Minister of Haiti for 8 years, he became the president of the Virginia Normal and Collegiate Institute, the state college for African Americans in Petersburg. Finally, in 1888, he waged a hotly fought race for Congress in Virginia's 4th District. After a protracted contest of the election results, he was declared the victor. So late in his term, however, that he served only a few months in 1891. He was the first and, for at least a century afterward, the only African American elected to Congress from Virginia. Langston's career seems the more remarkable in light of his early years. Though relatively privileged, his childhood was marked by emotional trauma and social dislocation. Born free on a Virginia plantation, he was the son of Ralph Quarles, a wealthy slaveholder, and Lucy Jane Langston, a part Native American, part black emancipated slave. The deaths in 1834 of both parents left 4-year-old John Mercer and his older brothers, Gideon Q. and Charles H. Langston, financially well provided for, but unprotected by Virginia law, and prompted Gideon and Charles to move to Ohio. Gideon's career is sketched below. Charles became a major figure in Northern Black political agitation in pre-war Ohio and post-war Kansas, and is best known as a hero of the Oberlin-Willington fugitive slave rescue case. Little John Mercer lived as part of the family of William Gooch, white friends of his father, on a farm near Chillicothe. Treated like a son and called Johnny Gooch, the light-skinned boy attended the whites-only public school. In 1839, young Langston suffered, in effect, a second orphaning when a court decree abruptly parted him from the Gooches, who were moving to the slave state, Missouri. He returned to the farm to board with its new white owners. In late 1840, his brother Gideon arranged for him to move to Cincinnati. Still struggling with his sense of being abandoned by the only family he knew, and being labeled as racially distinct from the Gooches, without experience in being black, John Langston, just turning 11, embarked on life in the black community of the most race-conscious city in the state. Placed in an amphitheater of hills giving onto the Ohio River, where boats and barges teemed against the backdrop of the slave shores of Kentucky, the Queen City of the West, Porkopolis, to the unromantic, provided a spectacle of Jacksonian aspirations. Animated, striving, growing in 4 decades from a frontier settlement to the 6th largest city in the nation in 1840. It was a town of red and white houses on clean, well-paved streets with tiled walkways, attractive shops, and neat and elegant private residences, and a town of swampy bottoms, rickety tenements, and mean, malodorous alleys, protean and joltingly democratic, where yesterday's raisin cake vendor was today's state congressman, progressive and reform-minded, boasting a system of public schools in which even the poorest Irish child might receive a free education, but no black child could. Violence-prone, with quote-unquote gentlemen of property and standing, not loath to form a mob against abolitionists and blacks, above all, exuberantly committed to exemplifying the potential of free men working in a free society, and shamelessly dedicated to placating its good customers of the South. With the city's economy revolving around commerce and trade, hogs, cattle, whiskey, flour, lumber, and a variety of manufactured products, leading businessmen took pains to nourish the commercial match with Southern cotton that had been struck early on. Even in the midst of the nationwide depression set off by the Panic of 1837, and despite losses of business, the city grew at record rates. Its population swelled by immigrants from the hard-hit eastern urban centers. Mechanics and builders were busy. Carriages bearing generous petticoated ladies rattled over the cobblestones. Rich Southern planters in tall beaver hats pushed through the throngs of horny-handed Ohio and Kentucky farmers. Burly German butchers festooned stalls in the famous market with garlands of sausages. Newly arrived Irish families stood in bewilderment on the docks. Rough rivermen, black and white, sought out satisfaction in brothels and bars. Steamboats anchored while others lined up for berths. Travelers above deck, cargo and slave coffle below. On the waterfront, muscular black roustabouts hoisted bales of cotton, tierce of tobacco, and salt pork, barrels of flour, sugar, coffee, molasses, fish, and whiskey. Black porters hustled for baggage to carry to the elegant hotels where Kentuckians liked to pass the summer months. Black draymen clattered from wharf to warehouse. Black stewards looked to the buying of fresh produce. Well-dressed black waiters pocketed their tips. The alert farm boy who simply walked the broad streets of Cincinnati acquired an education. Yet beneath the bustle, for a boy who was black, harder lessons lay. Although blacks struggled against crippling restrictions throughout Ohio, discrimination was nowhere more entrenched than in Cincinnati. All black Ohioans had to contend with the state's infamous black laws. The Ohio Constitution of 1802 denied blacks the franchise. Subsequently, the black laws, a series of discriminatory laws and court decisions, were adopted to discourage black immigration through such requirements as registration and the posting of surety. To exclude blacks from jury service and from testifying in legal cases involving white persons. To bar them from the militia, to deny them the benefits of the poor law and of institutions for the physically or mentally infirmed. And despite equal taxation of black-owned property, to exclude black children from the public school system. In Cincinnati, moreover, blacks met with all but universal segregation, proscription, and recurring violence or threat of violence. News that a slave had disappeared from a ship, or that white Southerners were in town to search for their missing bondservant, usually set off a hue and cry in which city authorities joined to look for signs of stolen property in the homes and shops of black residents and white abolitionists. In 1829 and in 1836, large-scale riots directed against blacks engulfed the city. The first riot resulted in the exodus of a large number of black residents. The second proved costly to white abolitionists as well as to blacks, when rioters destroyed the presses of the Philanthropist, an anti-slavery newspaper then edited by James G. Birney. In this volatile setting, John Mercer Langston first experienced the life of a black community. As luck would have it, when he arrived in Cincinnati in late 1840, it was just at the moment when a white backlash triggered by the rising socioeconomic status of the city's blacks, in combination with other factors, was about to erupt into yet another of Cincinnati's periodic manifestations of mob violence. Nevertheless, it was here that the impressionable boy first was exposed to enterprising black men and women who had established themselves as skilled workers and property owners to vigorous black institutions and to black community leaders. The evidence supports the mature Langston's own judgment, and I quote, "If there was ever existed in any colored community in the United States anything like an aristocratic class of such persons, it was found in Cincinnati. In fact, the entire Negro community of the city gave striking evidences in every way at this time of its intelligence, industry, thrift, and progress. And its matters of education and moral and religious culture furnished an example worthy of the imitation of their whole people. End quote. During his 2 years in Cincinnati, John Langston, barely 11 when he arrived, began to learn about the black kinship and culture that would sharpen his perceptions and help to give purpose and direction to his life. Blacks were so drawn by the ever-expanding economic opportunities to be found in the Queen City, some blacks called Cincinnati, quote unquote, the emporium of the West, that the black population there became the largest in the state, growing from an estimated 690 in 1826 to an official 2,240 by 1840. 5.1% of the city's 44,000 people. The city's black residents tended to be young and of Southern origin. Indeed, self-bought, manumitted, and freeborn Southerners fueled much of the dynamism and egalitarian idealism observed in the youthful black Cincinnati society of 1840, in which 80% of the population was less than 36 years of age. The 1840 Residential and Occupational Directory for the city listed 313 colored persons, who probably constituted the most successful group, 47% of whom had come from the slaveholding District of Columbia or slave states, principally Virginia and Kentucky. Augustus Wattles, a dedicated white abolitionist, who as a young man immersed himself in black community life, in 1834 calculated that 1,129 blacks in Cincinnati had known slavery. Of these ex-slaves, 476 had purchased themselves at a total cost of $215,522, or an average of about $450 per person, while many were currently involved in purchasing family members or friends. When a concerned Wattles visited a family to learn the reason for its children's irregular school attendance, he found the youngsters in the care of the eldest child, a 10-year-old, who explained, quote, "I'm staying at home to help my father," unquote. An 1845 canvass by Wattles' brother John revealed 369 self-emancipated slaves, about 1/5 of the adult population, who had paid $166,050 for their freedom. Such men and women, the black editor Reverend Charles B. Ray of New York was disposed to declare after a protracted stay in 1939, had the, quote, proper materials in their character to become industrious, economical, and reputable citizens, end quote. Combining skills learned in slavery with the ingenuity suggested by their playful saying, "If you can't find it, make it," quote unquote, and benefiting from the assistance of committed white sympathizers, black Cincinnatians registered economic gains in the late 30s. As migrants flowed into the city, the demand for essential services increased. Workers were necessary to hew and dig and haul, whitewash the walls, scrub the clothes and floors, mend and polish the shoes, cook the food, and saw the wood. Although always indifferent in reporting the women who performed many of these tasks, the city directory in 1840 listed 146 blacks who engaged almost double the figure of 4 years earlier. Because Irish immigrants who would compose 12% of the population in 1850, had just begun to arrive. Blacks had as yet few competitors for such work. In the wake of the 1837 panic, blacks also took advantage of the Depression-induced low cost of living and the institution of a near barter economy. Moreover, river and canal commerce continued to thrive, providing the major employment opportunities. By 1840, nearly one-fourth of the black workforce had jobs either on the several hundred steamboats that operated from Cincinnati's wharves or in other services and trades connected with the river. Besides their ordinary wages, which are good, Ray observed, black rivermen availed themselves to plentiful opportunities for trading at great profit in the lower country. And that was quoted. Among the 287 blacks listed as employed in the 1840 directory, 92 can be classified as semi-skilled, that is, workers at jobs demanding some talent and understanding of the marketplace, such as whitewashers, draymen, stewards, cooks, hucksters, butler, trader, gardener, fruit dealer, and barkeeper. And that was an increase of 250% in 4 years. The traditional classification of such workers as unskilled is cast in doubt by the fact that 38 of the 88 blacks worth $1,000 or more, according to the 1850 census, fall in this category. Furthermore, although laborers are always characterized as unskilled, 6 black Cincinnatians who held this title somehow managed to accumulate $1,000 or more by 1850. Indeed, 3 of the black community's most respected men are listed in unskilled occupations. The intellectual stevedore John I. Gaines at $3,000, the huckster Richard Phillips, $13,000, and the huckster Joseph J. Fowler, $18,000. Traditional classification of work are patently inadequate to measure either the worth or worthfulness of mid-19th century black Cincinnatians. In 1840, 90 blacks were recorded in 21 skilled occupations: 46 barbers, 10 carpenters, 6 shoemakers, 4 coopers, 3 bricklayers, 3 plasterers, 1 schoolteacher, 1 livery stable owner, and single assorted other artisans. Quote, colored mechanics were getting as much skilled labor as they can do, unquote, an observer remarked. Like the port cities of St. Louis and Boston, but in substantially more occupations, Cincinnati was beginning to employ black men in a variety of jobs that required a certain amount of expertness and responsibility. From 1836 to 1840, the number of blacks in the higher occupational tier increased from 83 to 182. The city's rise in population particularly benefited black barbers. It was no accident that the Black Parade in Columbus in the mid-1850s featured a giant razor and a plow. For throughout Ohio, barbering, a trade relegated exclusively to blacks, along with farming, offered the most economic security to black men. An example of the economic potential of barbering in Cincinnati was William W. Watson, an able community leader and young John Langston's future protector. Purchased from slavery by a family member only 8 years before, by 1840, Watson owned 2 brick houses and lots in town and another 560 acres in the Mercer County black farming settlement, as well as his own barber shop, expanded to include a bathhouse. Advantageously situated in the heart of the business district of Cincinnati. By 1850, when the number of black barbers had risen to 134, from the 46 of a decade earlier, Watson ranked as one of the community's outstanding financial successes, with declared property holdings of $5,500. His actual worth may have been greater. The white abolitionist James Freeman Clarke put it at some $30,000, while the black abolitionist Frederick Douglass put the barber on the same rung as Henry Boyd, the carpenter and bedstead manufacturer, who was widely advertised as the richest black man in Cincinnati. Besides the possibility of abolitionist exaggeration, the discrepancy in the reports of the wealth of such prospering and publicly protesting blacks as Watson may have arisen from several related factors. A copy of the census was deposited in the courthouse. Blacks were excluded from public facilities maintained by property taxes. Although they paid property taxes, they did not have access to public facilities. And black success might invite white retaliation. For example, Boyd's renowned furniture factory was burned again and again until finally, in 1859, he was no longer able to obtain fire insurance and he closed his business. Despite the special strains of purchasing family members from slavery and of coping with white harassment, by 1840, an impressive number of black Cincinnatians persuaded that to possess a homestead was to be independent and wealthy, had become property owners. That's a little convoluted, that statement. I'll try reading it again. Despite the special strains of purchasing family members from slavery and of coping with white harassment, by 1840, an impressive number of black Cincinnatians persuaded that to possess a homestead was to be independent and wealthy, had become property owners, noting that their property consists in that which is permanent and valuable in household lots and country land, 2,000 or more acres of which they owned in one plot. Reverend Charles B. Ray, in 1839, assessed their holdings at proportionately higher than those in other black communities in the North. Moreover, they are still accumulating faster than other people elsewhere. The white abolitionist Aimee D. Barber reported in 1840 that 9/10 of the black-owned houses and lots in the city had been purchased within the last 4 years. Besides the individual holdings, a joint stock enterprise entitled the Iron Chest Company, whose vice president was Gideon Langston, had been organized in September 1838. From the weekly dollar investments of its members, the company had erected 3 large brick buildings that it rented to whites, including the $19,000 valuation on 3 black churches. The total property worth of Cincinnati blacks in 1840 was estimated at $228,600. Blacks lived in some 10 clusters located around the city's outer perimeter and in the center of town. Although many of them lived close together for purposes of self-defense, society, and access to their own community institutions. The residential segregation practiced in Cincinnati during the pre-war era, given the constant stream of low-income immigrants was more economic than racial. The bulk of the unskilled black and white tended to concentrate in the most densely settled areas. Some 950 blacks and 8,000 whites lived in the East Central District, where both Germany, or over the Rhine, so called for its large number of Germans, and Bucktown, so called for its large number of blacks, were situated. Within this section, housing conditions varied considerably, from relative comfort of Germany, where the black school teacher and whitewash owner T.B. Nickens and other respected black leaders lived, to the misery of Bucktown, referred to as the bottoms, quote unquote, by the compassionate and probably by the residents themselves. In this wretched basin of tenements and shanties, drained by an odoriferous stream that carried the bloody runoff from pork processing houses, blacks and whites herded together, as a white journalist put it. As many as six family members found shelter in an 8 by 12-foot room. Under such circumstances, poverty, disease, violence, and criminality were good neighbors. In the mid-1830s, abolitionist commitment, in combination with a large, growing, and youthful black population and improving economic conditions, helped to invigorate black institutional life in Cincinnati. Building on a foundation of black community-directed efforts, extending back at least a decade, a group of young white abolitionists, the famous quote-unquote rebels of Lane Seminary, led by the Connecticut Yankees Theodore Dwight Weld and Augustus Wattles, rendered valuable assistance. In 1834, working closely with black leaders, including the Baptist minister David Nickens, the African Methodist Episcopal AME minister William Paul Quinn, the painter William M. Johnson, and the schoolteacher Owen Nickens. The rebels instituted an extensive program of instruction and uplift in an effort, as Weld put it, to create a spectacle of free black cultivation. 3 young white female teachers brought in from the East, called the Sisters, quote unquote, worked zealously on the project. Besides a lyceum and a library, day and night schools were established for both sexes and all ages, with instruction on topics ranging from the ABCs, sewing, and housekeeping to mathematics, abolitionism, and salvation. Morally and materially, the abolitionists contributed to the upsurge in black property holdings that occurred during the late 30s. Before you commenced schools, a black Cincinnati confided in 1840, I did not feel any interest in laying up property. I did not feel that I had a home here. If I earned property, I knew not but my house would be pulled down over my head by a mob. All I cared for was to have enough to eat and wear. Outside the city, black Cincinnatians' large land holdings in Mercer County resulted from Augustus Wattles' investment in their funds in the all-black farming community he instigated. At home, whites on occasion, following an example set in Mercer County, may have recorded property in their names while making out second titles to the actual black owners. The schooling and moral reform efforts of the reformers bore fruit. By 1839, the Colored Education Society, founded in 1836, was overseeing 3 private schools for black children in the city. Two of them were entirely supported by the black community, and one by the White Ladies Anti-Slavery Society of Cincinnati. While black financial contributions had risen from $150 in 1835 to $900, this performance, in combination with petitioning by blacks and white abolitionists, led to the city council's unprecedented allocation of black tax money to support a short-lived school in 1839 to 1840 for the children of the colored people, quote unquote. Under a constitution drafted by the schoolteacher Owen Nickens, the Moral Reform Society, which was organized shortly after the founding of its educational counterpart and had many of the same officers, pledged its members of both sexes to uphold the true principles of morality and integrity, and to work for the suppression of intemperance, licentiousness, gambling, Sabbath breaking, blasphemy, and all other vices. At the end of the decade, 1/4 of the adult black population of the free swinging port city belonged to temperance societies, with the result that black whiskey peddlers had to operate surreptitiously and drunken blacks seldom appeared on the streets. Respectable black life in Cincinnati had long centered on the black community's churches, particularly the abolitionist Bethel, AME, and Union Baptist. Bethel's origin dated back to 1824, when several black Methodists, rebelling against the requirement that blacks come last to the communion table at the city's predominantly white church, withdrew from it and, inspired by the itinerant missionary Moses Freeman, formed an AME congregation. Both Freeman and the convert Owen Nickens, who was appointed a local preacher, later recalled meeting in a cellar dubbed Jericho, where other gatherings occurred in homes, a blacksmith shop, and a house for processing lime. In 1834, the congregation purchased a lot on 6th Street, east of Broadway, where using the combined labors of the fellowship to erect a church designed by one of the members. One of the oldest black Baptist churches in the West and probably the largest, the Union congregation separated from the white Baptists in 1831, although it continued an uneasy coalition with them. In 1839, the black Baptists moved from the small brick church they had constructed to an imposing structure on Baker Street, formerly occupied by their white counterparts. Within 5 years, by using proceeds from fairs conducted by women of the church, converting donated goods into cash, and relying on contributions from members, the Barber Watson in particular, the church had paid all but $2,000 of the property's $9,000 purchase price. By 1848, it had cleared the entire debt. During the 1840s, when young John Langston attended the ministers, were two ex-Virginians, Charles Satchel, also a self-employed dyer, and the Oberlin-educated fugitive slave William P. Newman. Both Langston recalled, "We're possessed of a large ability, piety, and eloquence," quote unquote. Under their leadership, coupled with Watson's faithful service, the Union Baptist functioned as a missionary church to the black destitute and a mother church to nearly all the colored churches of its order in the Great Valley and in Canada. Fervent in condemning slavery and in opposing the church's pro-slavery apologists, as was the Zion Baptist, founded in 1843 by the pioneer minister missionary Wallace Shelton. The Union Baptist congregation infused its other major interests, the Sabbath school and the secular education of youth, with Christian abolitionist principles. Worship in these churches combined emotional release with reform values. Newman, in later years, endorsed as accurate a white woman's account of her visit to a black church that must have resembled the Union Baptist. This is a quote. No surly pew occupant placed a forbidding hand on the pew door. Seats, hymn books, crickets, and fans were at my disposal. The hymn was found for me. Everybody sang. It was infectious. I was among people to whom Sunday was neither a hugbear nor a bore. And such hearty singing, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow, but to my ear music, because it was soul, not cold science. I went home happy, for I had not fed my husks. I don't know what that means. Similarly, on a Sunday afternoon in late 1850, the Swedish traveler Fredrika Bremer called at the Bethel Aimee Church, which John Langston also attended during his sojourn in Cincinnati. The house was filled. The celebrants sang their own hymns, which Bremer found crowded with naivete, imagery, life. The singing ascended and poured forth like a melodious torrent. Heads, feet, and elbows moved all in unison amid evident enchantment and delight. And that is a quote. A very black young minister, in flowing eloquence, alluded to the recently enacted fugitive slave law and entreated the congregation to pray for the runaway and for the nation that would pass such an oppressive legislation. And in 1849, a British minister and his wife came away from a tea invitation at the neat and clean dwelling of the Zion Baptist minister Wallace Shelton, assured that blacks were deeply and justly disaffected toward the American people and the American laws. Arguably, the extensive religious conversion that occurred during the late 1830s, stimulated by pious blacks as well as evangelizing white radicals, helped to move black Cincinnatians toward self-help and protest. 41 is the, footnote, and I don't quite understand what that means. Arguably, the extensive religious conversion that occurred during the late 1830s, stimulated by pious blacks as well as evangelizing white radicals, helped to move black Cincinnatians toward self-help and protest. In 1840, Aimee D. Barber, an Oberlin theological student and former teacher of black children in Cincinnati, reported about 500 conversions over the past 4 years, bringing the total membership in the Union Baptist, Bethel AME, and ME churches to some 800. Religion for some was excitement merely, quote unquote, but there was more. Historians argue convincingly that evangelical Christianity, the Oberlin brand in particular, with its emphasis on moral excellence, stirred many whites to acts of benevolence, the most potent manifestation being the abolitionist crusade. That same force, mixed with African American religion, brought from the South, with its stress on emotional and sensory fulfillment, the two faiths having in common a respect for freedom, education, and individual responsibility and dignity, was seemingly no less effective in energizing a black self-help movement in the city and around the state. If the revolution in race relations was to occur, the cause of truth and justice, one God will sanction. As the devout Gideon Langston put it,
was to prevail, it had to begin. Cincinnati's black leadership generally agreed in the churches. The poet Madison Bell, who worshiped in the Bethel congregation during this period, later reflected, quote, "These Negro churches have done more to educate the heart and mind for freedom's blessings held in store than ever other means combined," unquote. By the time John Langston came to Cincinnati, 22 men, including his brother Gideon, had emerged as leaders in church and society as well as in educational, moral, and abolitionist enterprises. Nearly 3/4 of the group were native Virginians. All were employed, 6 as barbers, 4 as carpenters, 3 as hucksters, 2 as whitewashers, and 1 each as schoolteacher, painter, blasterer, tanner, dyer, steward, and livery stable operator. Footnote: newspaper readers and keen observers, these leaders profited from occupations that positioned them to receive and transmit political intelligence. This was particularly true of the barbers, who included Andrew J. Gordon, one of the state's premier black orators. The literate W. H. Yancey, co-editor of the Colored Citizen, one of 2 black newspapers published briefly in the city during the 1840s. John Liverpool, a pioneer leader in Cincinnati and corresponding secretary in Ohio for the early National Black Convention movement. John Hatfield and William O'Hara, key conductors for the Underground Railroad. Footnote: and William W. Watson. Certain traits distinguished them individually and as a group. Augustus Wattles, who enjoyed more intimate terms with the black community than any other white man in Cincinnati, singled out the leader's honesty, uprightness, and industry. A sophisticated black observer, the Baptist minister Newman, was struck by the pride and strength the leaders seemed to derive from their community's advancing number, intelligence, and wealth. The well-traveled editor, Ray, believed that to a greater extent than in any other black community he had visited, important principles prevailed among the leaders' primary union and confidence in each other's integrity. Taking in leadership and community, Ray pronounced black Cincinnatians the best population of our people I have ever seen or heard of. Moreover, these black men of property and standing embodied a sense of racial obligation, the essence of which several articulated in 1837. And this is a quote: "Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hand to God," is the declaration of infinite goodness and wisdom. It must take place and will doubtless be effected by human agency. And who so proper as educated colored people to be the heralds of the gospel and teachers of science and civilization to their benighted brethren in all lands? Speaking in 1845, Solomon P. Chase of Cincinnati, a future state senator, governor of Ohio, and Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who had already made a name for himself with his legal defense of fugitive slaves, and in anti-slavery politics, summed up the achievement of the black community, contrasting the situation in his boyhood 20 years before, when the colored inhabitants were hardly in a better condition than slaves, to their current visibly improved condition. Chase declared, "Debarred from the public schools, you have established schools of your own, thrust by prejudice into the obscure corners of the edifices in which white men offer prayer. You have erected churches of your own. Excluded from the witness box, you have sought for that security which the law denies, in a favorable public opinion propitiated by your good conduct." End quote. On the self-help foundation of the 30s, the leadership went on to build a broad array of political and protest activities in the 2 decades before the war, working aggressively in cooperation with other Black communities in the state to further the objectives of full freedom and equality. Although Gideon Langston and other leaders of the Cincinnati Black community eased the way, 11-year-old John, fresh from the Chillicothe farm and still harboring wistful memories of the Gooches, doubtless was more confused than impressed by his introduction to the Black society and political culture of the city. Any hopes he had of living with his brother Gideon were dashed. After coming to Ohio, Gideon had entered Oberlin Institute's preparatory department in 1835, where he and his brother Charles were Oberlin's first Black students. Gideon then established himself in business in Cincinnati, opening a barber shop and shortly thereafter the only Black-owned livery stable in the city. But he had remained a bachelor and as such was unprepared to care for the boy. Instead, Gideon found John a boarding space with John Woodson, a fellow community leader whose home was situated on 6th Street, east of Broadway, and north of the canal, in the section the boy knew as Germany. Like Gideon, Woodson, a master carpenter, was an officer and stockholder in the Iron Chest Company. This is a quote. Steady, industrious, and cherishing proper ideas of what is necessary for Black elevation, unquote. As the philanthropist editor Gamaliel Bailey said to him and 2 other Black builders, Woodson, a former Virginian, was compiling a solid record of involvement in local and state organizations for education, moral elevation, and self-help. As superintendent of the Sabbath School of the Bethel Aimee Church, Woodson, whom Langston characterized as fairly educated and efficient, entered John into its membership. It is likely that John also joined the Children's Temperance Group, which had existed for more than 5 years and was of special interest to Woodson as an officer of the Moral Reform Society. On weekdays, John went to the basement of the Black Baptist Church on Baker Street, some distance away, to the school taught by the Reverends Mr. Denham and Goodwin. Langston later remembered these white teachers who had been at the work for several years as even-tempered, enthusiastic men of considerable learning, able to win the respect and confidence of their pupils. Charging $3 per quarter in advance and affording the rare opportunity of a full-year term, the school enjoyed a healthy enrollment, drawing not only local children but also those who, like John, had been sent from other more deprived areas for the educational advantages of the city. An average of 65 boys and girls attended. According to Langston's recollection, the pupils displayed a high order of morality and scholarship. Cincinnati school children had been praised for eagerness since the opening of the first Lane Rebel Project School in 1834, when children had begged to be taken in. That's a quote with a footnote. Nevertheless, on initial acquaintance, Johnny's new school, like his new surroundings as a whole, must have seemed strange and constricted. Although his schooling had been neglected of late, it was soon apparent that he was one of the better scholars. As for his classmates in general, years of enforced ignorance and poverty had left deep imprints on their young minds. Some of them may have been among those students at Hiram Gilmore High School in 1848, who struck the visiting Black abolitionist Martin Delaney as having learned comparatively nothing except perhaps a little business education and some music for show purposes, but no science and no English composition. They don't capitalize I. quote unquote. The effects of limited opportunity were also apparent at John's Sabbath School, where white abolitionists, while praising the neat dress, good order, and appearance of intelligence of the pupils, noted with regret that this was the solitary instruction some received. Footnote. For John, moreover, the Bethel Church demonstrated services may well have seemed strange after the proper Presbyterians of Chillicothe. And what was he to make of men and women of the black upper class, like Woodson and his associates, whose constant striving to maintain home and institutions contrasted sharply with the easy circumstances of the white families he had known? Even while the boy responded to the culture, learning new phrases such as "you creature, you," quote unquote, another quote, "a squash of fat," and another quote, "studies about it," stopping off at a confectioner's shop for a sugar plum or a stick of candy from the big barrel, playing at marbles or splashing in the canal on hot summer days, sniffing the strong odors of frying pork or fatback in narrow alleys, listening to the music of the black boatmen, one man singing a stanza, others coming in on the chorus. He had few clues to the puzzle of his own place in it. The grammatical question of I were simple for Johnny Langston. The psychological, more than ordinarily complex and painful. The city's turbulent racial and anti-abolitionist climate that spring and summer of 1841 could only heighten the boy's anxieties. A number of factors: a controversial court decision regarding a fugitive slave, the activities of blacks and some white abolitionists to help slaves escape, set against the often violent attempts to reclaim them, the building white resentment of rising black prosperity and confidence, and the general economic unrest all contributed to the rise of the impending conflict. In late May, the Cincinnati attorney, Solomon Chase, appeared in the Howland County Court to represent Mary Towns, a Kentucky slave who had lived in Cincinnati as a free woman for 10 years before being charged as a fugitive by her master. Judge Nathaniel C. Reed, conforming to arguments earlier advanced by Chase in two highly publicized cases, granted Towns her freedom. Since the slave owner's affidavit did not explicitly charge her with having escaped from Kentucky into Ohio, Chase argued she could not be considered a fugitive slave. In freeing Towns, Judge Reed declared that in Ohio, liberty is the rule, involuntary servitude the exception. Quote, unquote. The decision alarmed conservative business leaders who feared it might alienate trading partners in the South. In response, playing on fears of damage to the Southern trade, the influential Cincinnati Daily Enquirer renewed its periodic alert about the malign influences of abolitionism, condemning the practice of assisting fugitive slaves as particularly disruptive of relations with the South. The Enquirer began a summer campaign of demanding action against those responsible. Footnote. New to the city and young as he was, John nonetheless doubtless already knew something of the operations of the Underground Railroad, in which his brother Gideon, his landlord John Woodson, and such notables as William W. Watson were involved. Helping slaves off the steamboats or from over the river and concealing them once they were in the city, blacks assisted by white sympathizers over the years had made Cincinnati a major portal from slavery to freedom. While members of the Bethel Church regularly helped runaways, the Iron Chest Company also included among its enterprises the care and protection of fugitives. and this is a quote, such matters are almost uniformly managed by the colored people. The abolitionist James G. Birney confided to Lewis Tappan in 1837, an assertion echoed by Levi Coffin, who was called the superintendent of the Underground Railroad when he took up residence in the city a decade later. Although the work was necessarily clandestine, one black man referred to under railway agents as being initiated into the mysteries of Sybil, and that's a quotation, and dangerous, it engendered the kind of personal satisfaction expressed by the trusted agent John Hatfield. And this is a quote. I never felt better pleased with anything I ever did in my life than in getting a slave woman clear when her master was taking her from Virginia. And that's a footnote. If John's imagination could enter into not only the adventure, but also the morality of violating the law to aid a fellow human being to freedom, the boy was all the more alarmed by the recurrent mob action against them who succored fugitives. This is a quote. When their hiding places were discovered, it mattered little what the color of the protector was. Langston remembered, quote, popular feeling was quickly aroused, and in not a few cases manifested itself in violence against those concerned in such transactions, end quote. Thus, the entire black community had reason for concern in early August 1841, when a letter purportedly from a fugitive to his still enslaved wife came to light, naming two black residents of Cincinnati, William O'Hara, a barber, and George Casey, probably William Casey, a riverman, from whom help could be expected. The escapee advised his wife to tell her trusted friends, quote, that if they can once get to Cincinnati, they can get liberty, and that the colored men in the boats will whisper in their ears where to find abolitionists, end quote. Enraged by this evidence of a nefarious conspiracy, the Enquirer declared the city overrun by few blacks, laboring when they do labor in competition with white citizens, and when they do not, subsisting by plunder, end quote. It called on township trustees to enforce the seldom observed state law of 1807 requiring blacks to post $500 bond within 20 days of their arrival in Ohio. If they did not post bond and could not, the Enquirer demanded that they leave the city. Footnote. Wow, that's major. That the Enquirer actually instigated this riot, which I will be reading about as we move further. In the company of landlord or brother Johnny Langston, surely attended the ceremonies held in August 1st, 1841, despite the growing hostility, to commemorate the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. Since 1838, when black Cincinnatians had held a watch night service to mark the official termination of the apprenticeship system in the British possessions, celebration of the 1st of August had become an annual event, as it was in a growing number of black northern communities. With many of the city's black leaders taking part, William M. Johnson presided over the 1841 observance, an elaborate family-oriented affair that opened at Bethel AME, continued at Baker Street Baptist, and concluded with an elegant temperance dinner, prepared by a black caterer and served outdoors. Young Joseph Henry Perkins, who on a like occasion in 1849 would proudly describe black contributions and excoriate, quote, the victuals of Afric's bleeding but unoffending children, end quote, acted as orator of the day. Woodson's foreman, J.L. Tinsley, led the toast to the day we celebrate, honor for an event which must ultimately result in the abolition of slavery throughout the world, end quote. And Aimee Sumner declared that the West Indies independence admonished all oppressors in every nation that the day is at hand when the hand of Almighty God will surrender the chains of the oppressed in every land, end quote. As much as the forthright rhetoric, the success of the well-organized celebration evidenced the considerable socioeconomic progress and political awareness that the Cincinnati Black community had attained. Nonetheless, these very factors were stimulating rancor among whites. On a psychological level, the Englishman Edward Abdy's observation made during a visit to Cincinnati in 1834 was still apt. Whites spoke of self-improving blacks, quote, with a degree of bitterness that dictated a disposition to be more angry with their virtues than with their vices, end quote. Whether or not blacks actually assumed the air of fellows in authority or took the inside of the pavement upon all occasions, as critics charged, more than one Cincinnatian was angered simply by respectable and responsible black behavior. White men are naturally indignant, a white working man explained, when they see a set of idle blacks dressed up like ladies and gentlemen strutting about our streets and flinging the rights of petition and discussion in our faces. That is a quote, and there's a footnote to it. The economy and the weather exacerbated the festering discontent. In early August, drought and heat dropped the Ohio River to an unprecedented low water mark, throwing many whites as well as black laborers out of work. Meanwhile, overall economic conditions remained unstable, with new bank closings imminent. As the Enquirer continued to charge blacks and abolitionists with the major responsibility for business difficulties and job losses, whoa, the philanthropists rebuked those Southern editors who were threatening that the South would sever business relations with Ohioans if alleged fugitive slaves were not returned to their owners. This is a quote. Madmen, a pretty thing for you to be talking of non-intercourse, while nothing but respect for the power of the free states protects you from the desolating vengeance of the united black race of the Western Hemisphere, end quote, footnote. I'll have to read that again because I don't quite understand it. In the defiant spirit of the 1st of August proceedings, the Philanthropist, which is a black publication, rebuked those Southern editors who were threatening that the South would sever business relations with Ohioans if alleged fugitive slaves were not returned to their owners. Okay, so this is what the Philanthropist said. Madmen, a pretty thing for you to be talking of non-intercourse, while nothing but respect for the power of the free states protects you from the desolating vengeance of the united black race of the Western Hemisphere. Okay, now, next paragraph. Little was needed to trigger a riot. As August turned to September, lived, a youthful white gang pelted several well-dressed black men with gravel. As other blacks joined in, a fight ensued that wounded several persons on both sides. Rumor had it that a white youth was so badly cut that his bowels fell out. Sometime after midnight, the following day, an armed white party burst into a black hotel, the Dumas House on McAllister Street, demanding a black man surrender to them, only to be repulsed. Yet another scuffle between whites and blacks, reportedly with some injuries to the former, broke out in the lower market soon after. Footnote. And I might add, it's rather doubtful that you would hear anything about this in white papers other than, such as the Inquirer, other than the negative aspect for African Americans. So this is phenomenal information that I'm reading for the very first time. I'm sharing this book with you, and I'm trying to think of a way to entice members of the Black community to listen to this book as I read it. I'm not asking you to read it. I am reading it. But to listen, because it's revealing information that white newspapers would not publish, information that otherwise would be hidden to us, except we did the research necessary that these people in 1988 did, who compiled these essays. So it's being brought forth to me. I just want to share it with you and give us all some idea of where our ancestors, not in the South, from the South to Cincinnati, what they suffered here in this city. So I'm a little hot, and I'm going to continue. By Friday, September the 3rd, even a black child could recognize that a full-scale white attack seemed inevitable. As numbers of Kentuckians swelled the crowds, and city officials made no move to intervene, Johnny Langston heard, quote, high and open threats conveyed in vulgar, base expressions, which indicated the possibility and probability of an early attack, unquote. It was Langston's recollection, which subsequent events seemed to confirm, that black elders, stiffening for the onslaught, armed themselves with guns, planned their defense, and, in an all but unique action in the history of pre-war race riots, chose a leader to direct it. The man was Major J. Wilkerson, a 28-year-old self-purchased mulatto who acted as an AME missionary to establish churches and schools in the West. Wilkerson offered this family history in his memoir. This is a quotation. A Virginian by birth, born not far from Little York, a town of no little renown, and as to his blood, he is of the Bengal of Africa, Anglo-Saxon of Europe, Powhatan of America, and that's Indian, but strictly the grandson of Colonel Wilkerson, who fought with one of the bravest of the brave, namely General Gates, at the Battle of Saratoga, New York, end quote. Langston recalled that the Cincinnati black community had full confidence in the man. Footnote. By 8:00 p.m. that night, a white mob, having assembled openly in Fifth Street Market, moved toward the black homes and businesses clustered around 6th and Broadway, the section where Johnny Langston boarded. In the outrageous, barbarous, and deadly attack upon the entire class of the colored people, this is a quote, that followed, as Langston put it, the mob assaulted blacks. Another quote, wherever found upon the streets, and with such weapons and violence as to cause death in many cases, no respect being had to the character, position, or innocence of those attacked, end quote. Behind windows and doors, and on rooftops of houses at 6th and Broadway, and along the alley leading from New to 6th, armed blacks waited. The rioters, after razing a black confectioner's shop and shouting down the mayor, who had attempted to remonstrate with them, advanced into New Street, brandishing bludgeons, and demanding of white residents where the blacks lived. Footnote. Suddenly, the black defenders, doubtless under orders from Major Wilkerson, launched their counterattack, opening fire from the alley with rifles and muskets and wounding several whites. This is a quote. The crowd gave back towards Broadway, a white witness reported. Another quote, the Negroes rallied and came into the street, firing their guns and throwing missiles at the crowd as it was retreating, and pursued the crowd to Broadway, end quote. To cover the black charge, shots were fired into the retreating mob from the frame house in Broadway occupied by the black steamboat steward Asbury Young. Footnote. Reportedly yelling out a wild shout of triumph and defiance. Some 50 armed black men succeeded in pushing the mob full 100 yards from their houses. Despite a heavy rain shower and further firing from the black defenders, by 1 a.m. the attackers had collected themselves sufficiently to drag an iron 6-pounder from the river to the corner of 6th and Broadway, stuff the cannon with boiler punchings, and discharge it at least 3 times down 6th. Far into the night, the firing continued until a military contingent summoned by the mayor moved in to keep the mob at bay. Footnote. Although the black defense had succeeded, the struggle was not over. An early morning meeting of white citizens at the courthouse, presided over by the mayor, resulted in a hasty agreement on a number of issues. The enforcement of black laws, including the requirement of bonding, the return of all fugitive slaves, the repudiation of the doctrines and activities of abolitionists, and most immediately, complete disarmament of blacks and the arrest of black lawbreakers. With the riot area under martial law for blacks, but under mob law for whites, none of whom were arrested, swarms of improvised black officers spread across the city in search of blacks, dragging off servants or waiters or barbers, combing black residents for men and arms, collecting what the Enquirer described as enough weapons to supply an Algerine pirate vessel, quote unquote, in a futile gesture toward reconciliation. Some blacks met to promise compliance with the laws and thank city officials for their efforts to protect them. Herded into the square at 6th and Broadway and penned in by a guard of soldiers, blacks were not permitted to leave even when they gave bond. Late in the day, some 300 black men, whether sound or maim, were marched off to jail while whites struck and kicked and jeered at them. Footnote. Early that morning, John Langston was in Woodson's home, where a black neighbor dashed in to warn him of the impending arrest of blacks. Although allegedly the jailing was for their self-protection, Langston later wrote that in actuality, the colored men were imprisoned because it had been thoroughly shown by their conduct that they had become so determined to protect themselves against whatever odds that great and serious damage might be expected were they again assaulted. End quote, with footnote. After watching Woodson and his assistant, Tinsley, hide themselves in the chimneys of the house, the boy took off through the backyard and garden, jumped over the fence into the alley, and headed down Main Street to the canal bridge. He was determined to warn Gideon, whose barber shop was near 4th and Main, more than a mile away. At the middle of the bridge, John heard police officers behind him ordering him to stop. Terrified, he raced onward until nearly to his goal, stumbled into a drugstore and fainted. The white druggist, friends of his brother, carried him to Gideon's rooms, where he was revived and told his story. Well aware of the city order and already in hiding, fearful that Johnny might have been followed, Gideon settled in behind barred doors and windows to listen and wait, his exhausted brother at his side. Gideon's 5 employees hid with them. Finally, in the concealing dusk, the boy ventured out with his youthful white merchants to a confectionery to buy food for the hungry men, who had eaten nothing for some 15 hours. Listening in the darkness, Johnny heard the howls and yells and screams and oaths and vulgarities of the rioters as they dragged the press of the philanthropist down Main Street and threw it into the river. Footnote: they destroyed the bakery of the naturalized Englishman Cornelius Burnett, who often succored fugitives and attacked the abolitionist book depository. Raiding parties searched out blacks' homes, where windows were broken, doors smashed, children frightened, and poor women insulted. Late in the night, they descended on 6th and Main, battered the Bethel Church, and again attacked the houses, where only women and children remained. The Daily Cincinnati Chronicle reported scenes of greater real atrocity, though with less personal injury, than on the evening before. The Daily Cincinnati Gazette acknowledged that the city had been, quote, in a complete anarchy, controlled mostly by the lawless and violent mob, end quote. Although Governor Thomas Corwin issued a proclamation calling for cessation of the violence, neither military companies, police, nor large numbers of deputized citizens offered effective resistance to the rioters. At length, after a few arrests were finally made, the mob dispersed from sheer exhaustion. Footnote: on Sunday, John came out of hiding to a dazzling sunshiny day. The solemn, awful tread and tramp of the mounted constabulary intruded on an almost religious silence. Like Ishmael, the boy was struck by the cruel dissonance of natural serenity and human violence. It would have been a day fit for the calm and peaceful worship of our Heavenly Father in a civilized and Christian community. As it was, however, the horrid sight of the vast company of such policemen, with the recollection of the sad, dire events of the preceding nights and days, drove every feeling of love and veneration out of the hearts of those who had thus been outraged and terrified. End quote, with footnote. It had been the most destructive and violent rioting in the city's history. Indeed, it may well have been the most severe urban outbreak against blacks in pre-Civil War America, although Langston remembered a high death toll among white attackers. The black defenders, no accurate count of the dead and wounded or of the amount of property damage was attempted. Footnote. In accordance with the rioters' demand that the state law of 1807 be enforced, however, a city official did disclose the posting of bonds by more than 100 blacks and mulattoes. Kentucky slaveholders invited to inspect the black prisoners before their release claimed one as a fugitive slave. Footnote. Not appeased, a group of anti-abolitionists formed a new society to forward their aims. On the other hand, the philanthropists continued publication, picking up a few new subscribers and renewed support from the old. Langston believed that the riot had also served to embolden such anti-slavery adherents as Solomon P. Chase and Samuel Lewis, who subsequently joined with Gamaliel Bailey in giving force to the fledgling Liberty Party. Footnote. The effect on the black community was profound. An abolitionist census of black Cincinnatians in 1845 showed that despite a population increase of about 600 since 1840, their private property holdings had dropped by nearly $50,000 during the 5-year period, an indication, however, imperfect, of the extent of the property loss and the difficulty of economic rebuilding in a time of increased financial retrenchment. In the months immediately following the riot, another white observer of black Cincinnati's noted a manifest depression of their energy and zeal in behalf of the schools and even of their private investments. Blacks themselves began seriously considering immigration to Canada. By the fall of 1842, a black Oberlin student reported that 9 of the city's most respectable black families, in addition to several young men, already had left for Canada, explaining that, quote, times are very dull, money very scarce, nothing doing, and prejudice very great, end quote. At the same time, black community leaders took pains to contradict a rumor that a number of blacks desired to or intended to move to Liberia. Within 2 months of the riot, before a large crowd assembled at the abolitionists' 6th Presbyterian Church, such leaders as George Carey, William O'Hara, John Liverpool, Charles Satchel, A.M. Sumner, and William W. Watson repudiated the American Colonization Society and its Liberian project. And that's a footnote. I did some reading on that, and I'll share that information with you about how Cincinnatians, one in particular, Charles McMicken of the University of Cincinnati, he was very instrumental in providing money for this colonization initiative to send Cincinnati freed slaves to Africa, back to Africa. So I'm interested in seeing that footnote because it is marked here. At the 1843 National Convention of Colored Citizens in Buffalo, New York, Sumner, speaking also for fellow delegates Watson and Andrew J. Gordon, voiced opposition to the adoption of Reverend Henry Highland Garnett's militant address to the slaves. Sumner argued that the call for a slave insurrection could endanger not only those free blacks living in the South, but also those who lived in the border areas of free states. This is a quote, we of Cincinnati, he declared, are ready to meet anything that may come upon us unprovoked, but we are not ready injudiciously to provoke difficulty. Despite the legacy of fear left by the riot because of the Black defense, there was also a legacy of pride, which the Black abolitionist William C. Nell, visiting the city with Langston 15 years later, observed. From the perspective of his own years in the Black movement, Langston later wrote that the riot and the restrictive measures failed to, quote, hush the voices of the eloquent colored men themselves, who through such experience were learning what their rights were. The riot may well have served as an emotional watershed. The desperation that pushed the boy over Woodson's fence to seek out and warn the one person he could claim as his family in that dangerous city was a telling measure of his lonely insecurity in his new life. The pulse-pounding moment on the canal bridge when he was identified as a Black, his race to his brother, and his venture into the night to procure food for Gideon and his workers may all have made him feel intensely a participant in the Black experience. Repelled and frightened by the depravity of the white attackers, thrilled by the courage of the Black defenders, he could have felt the sense of unity engendered in members of groups by sudden adversity. Later, he may have experienced the survivor's sense of his own, as well as community's uniqueness and value, and of kinship to one's fellows. The knowledge that white abolitionists, too, were suffering could take him toward an appreciation of the possibilities of Black-white union for the cause. Moreover, it is possible that the very savagery of the riot served to vent the violent and inexpressible anger, fear, and grief that had seized him when he was torn from the Gooches, moving him toward a sense of closure and to an acceptance of his Black identity. Toward the beginning of John's second year in Cincinnati, he looked up from his school desk at the sound of a familiar voice and saw Colonel William Gooch. Together on a bench, Johnny and Gooch passed an emotional afternoon reviewing their separate existences, the boy asking eagerly about Matilda and Virginia Gooch, the women he had considered his mother and sister. The colonel, who was back in Ohio to make final settlement of his property in Chillicothe, assuring him of their affectionate concern. John promised that when he reached his majority, he would rejoin the Gooch family in Missouri. Gooch's departure left the boy deeply affected but not despairing. In school and out, he had duties to attend to and associations to explore. Shortly after the riot, John changed his address from the eastern to the south-central part of the city, a move that brought him closer to school and to Gideon and into the household of the redoubtable William W. Watson. Watson's classic story of bondage and freedom, already well known among abolitionists, contained more than enough drama to thrill his young boarder. In 1832 in Lexington, Kentucky, Watson, then 24, and a sable son of Virginia, was put up for sale. Standing on an auction table, Watson pointed to his weeping wife and little daughter and pled successfully with potential buyers to abstain from bidding. Instead, he was purchased by his brother-in-law for $650. The latter, a Cincinnati barber, had raised the purchase price by persuading two white merchants to endorse his note, on which he had then borrowed an exorbitant interest. Working in his brother-in-law's shop, and also as a waiter, Not only did Watson pay off the note within the year, he subsequently purchased 4 other family members for a total exceeding $3,000, while embarking on his own barbering business and making substantial investments in real estate. In her published justification for Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, a resident of Cincinnati during the time she was gathering material for the book, named Watson, along with 5 other former slaves she had met there, as men who exemplified the capability of the race, conquering for themselves, this is quote, conquering for themselves comparative wealth and social position, unquote, by their, quote, self-denial, energy, patience, and honesty, end quote. Footnote. John Langston, who found Watson's brick house, with its well-furnished and pleasant rooms and parlors, attractive, rightly perceived the social position of Watson and his wife, Ruth Ellen, as conspicuous and influential. Besides the large number of family members and boarders, a total of 17 persons was recorded in the home by the 1840 federal census. Frequent visitors kept the household lively. Frederick Douglass, noting in 1850 that Watson, his esteemed friend, was the first black Cincinnatian to offer him hospitality, advised he who would know whether colored people know how to live in a state of freedom might soon receive the desired information by making Mr. W. W. Watson a visit. End quote and footnote. Because the children of Cincinnati's enterprising black families, the very best and most highly educated and cultured young persons, as Langston put it, congregated in the Watsons' parlor. John made new friendships and deepened others initiated during his first tentative months in the city. The most notable was with Peter H. Clark, the son of the successful barber Michael Clark. A precocious youngster, exactly John's own age, Peter Clark so forward in his studies that he would be employed as a teaching assistant after 2 years of study at Gilmore High School, where he finished his education, was destined to become an eminent educator and political leader. Riveted in young manhood by common reform concerns, Langston and Clark began a relationship that lasted until Langston's death, when Clark referred brokenly to the loss of the only friend, this is a quotation, who remains to me from my boyhood days, with a footnote. Like others in the industrious Watson household, where the 1840 census recorded 9 males employed, John, while continuing his schooling, began to work at his landlord's barber shop and bathhouse, ran errands, and carried towels for whatever tips came his way. Rendered inconspicuous by age and role, John could closely observe the black barbers and their patrons, the majority of whom were white, although, since Watson and his companions in black reform repeatedly reproved those Cincinnati barbers who operated racially segregated shops, black customers may well have been accommodated. The propensity of men to talk over the small beer of the week in such a setting acquainted the boy with current issues and ideas. At the same time, he could appreciate the personal qualities of the black barber: diplomacy, a liking of good talk and companionship, and a need to be abreast of events both abroad and in his own provincial sphere. That often made him an able politician and community leader, not only in Cincinnati but elsewhere. Watson and his staff pleased and won their customers, John concluded, by skill, efficiency, decorum, and honesty. As for the patrons, one at least provided John an object lesson in thrift and temperance. the well-heeled dandy who often tossed 50 cents and sometimes $1 to the boy for polishing his boots, commenced drinking and gaming. And I asked him, wait a minute, this is a quotation, commenced drinking and gaming, and I have lived to see him willing to black my boots for 10 cents, and had I asked him, unquote. Under the mask of lather, moreover, men sometimes revealed their passions and prejudices. Peter Clark, Langston's friend, who as a young man worked in his father's barber shop, once related that a white man whom he was shaving had asked to be introduced to colored women. When Clark refused, the customer, sneering, referred to his shop's serving niggers, whereupon Clark hurled a shaving cup to the floor, avowing never to shave a white man again unless to cut his throat. Oh, yeah. If Watson and his workers also resented being at the beck and call of offensive white men, the boot black might note the mechanisms of self-defense under the disguise of accommodation, unimpeachable politeness, but perhaps an accidental nick if an offensive customer's chin, a top coat brushing so assiduous it scraped the shoulders beneath, a flattening appraisal of an unappealing cut of hair or beard. Past midnight, when black masks descended, in the sweeping of the day, the young boot black would count out his earnings before his encouraging elders, who offered counsel on pleasing customers, hard work, and frugility. Delighted to have mounting savings as well as pocket money, John began and envision himself as a successful and thrifty man. End quote, footnote. Business, however, he observed, was to be balanced with larger obligations. Watson, a staunch Baptist who agreed with white abolitionists that the Sabbath should be observed for worship, refused to open his shop for the Saturday closing until 5 a.m. From the Saturday closing until 5 a.m. Monday. Any financial loss he suffered was set against a psychological gain, that could hardly have escaped John's notice. The transformation from Saturday night's barber, as liable to be called boy, as John himself, to Sunday morning's Reverend Watson and Mr. Watson, in a society whose religious and secular joys and sorrows exited outside of white reckoning. John again enjoyed the reflected glory of his landlord's prestigious position in the church, for, like Woodson at the Bethel Aimee, Watson served as superintendent of the Sabbath school for the Union Baptist on Baker Street, of which he was also a trustee. This man of vigorous mental parts with limited education, as Langston described him, whose command of religious discourse was such that black political gatherings frequently called upon him to offer prayer, taught the most advanced Bible class in which he enrolled Johnny. In his church were good oratory and, as a white visitor remarked, hymns beautifully and exquisitely sung, were staples, the boy added, to his store of knowledge of the rhythms and variety of black oral expression, and to his appreciation of the black American's religious music. Music that depicted an enlarged universe, roaming between past history, present circumstance, and future promise, bestowing a sense of peace and inner freedom, calling upon thoughtful reflection. Most important, John experienced the Union Baptist Church, as in the Bethel Aimee, the power of black self-determination. The black church, a mature John Langston later maintained in describing the founding of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, not only represented, quote, the organized Christian protest of the colored American against unjust, inhumane, and cruel complexional discriminations, end quote, but also offered him the, quote, opportunity to be himself, to think his own thought, express his own conviction, make his own utterance, test his own powers, cultivate self-reliance, and thus, in the exercise of the faculties of his soul, trust and achieve, end quote, footnote. During his second year at Denham and Goodwin School, John progressed rapidly to the point where he and one other boy, probably Peter H. Clark, composed the highest class. Despite the traditional nature of the curriculum, ancient history, advanced arithmetic and grammar, and elementary science, the preoccupations of students and teachers meant that John was acquiring the rudiments of an anti-slavery education as well. In a typical assignment for the day, to write an essay on Alfred, King of the Saxons, a 16-year-old black pupil in a similar Cincinnati school responded, at one time, Alfred did not know his ABC, but before his death, he commended nations. I think if the colored people study like King Alfred, they will soon do away with the evil of slavery. I can't see how the Americans can call this a land of freedom where so much slavery is, end quote. Just as the white Ohio schoolboy William Dean Howells, wearing a paper hat and flourishing a wooden sword, dreamed of the martial glory of English and American heroes. John and his classmates also fastened for inspiration on these classic figures, but they emulated modern black liberationists as well. In particular, with the terrifying events of the riot impressed upon his memory, John was excited by the story of the slave mutineers of the ship Amistad, and we know of that from the movie, if nothing less, and their leader, the valiant Cinque, or as Langston and other contemporaries spelled it, Chinque, Cinque. In the summer of 1839, Cinque, said to be an African prince, led an uprising of his 52 fellow captives aboard the Spanish schooner Amistad. Though the Africans gained control of the ship, they were overtaken by a U.S. government brig off the coast of Long Island and arrested, but not before Cinque had dived overboard swimming, like an otter, first upon his back, then upon his breast, evading his captors for nearly an hour. With the ex-president John Quincy Adams representing the Africans, their case was eventually decided in their favor by the U.S. Supreme Court. The abolitionists extracted full publicity value from it using such devices as the sale of Cinque's picture for $1. Like blacks in other communities, Cincinnati's blacks not only tracked Cinque's likeness to their walls, and told their children his story, they contributed to his defense fund. After the Africans had finally won their freedom, Gideon Langston, speaking for the black community, was able to thank Adams personally for his able defense, by which means a number of our fellow men were raised from a level with the brute creation and placed in the scale of human existence, end quote. So meaningful was the memory of this history of John Mercer Langston, he went on to name his first daughter Cinque. end quote. Not a quote, that was a footnote. In 1843, Haiti was also much in the news because of the attempt of several congressmen. Adams' untiring efforts won Gideon Langston's praise to extend official recognition to the Black Caribbean Republic. This issue also caught John's interest. Excited by the Haitian Revolution and its heroes, whom Black Cincinnatians frequently toasted at 1st of August celebrations, the boy familiarized himself with Haitian history. Langston would later name his first son Dessalines, after one of the heroes of the Haitian Revolution. Dessalines? The anti-slavery crusade provided ready topics for John's early rhetorical efforts. Like the youthful white orators in the common schools, whose vehement action led Harriet Martineau to wonder in mock dismay which of them would speak in Congress hereafter, John and his classmates frequently participated in plays, special exercises, and public exhibitions. The boys decked out in starched collars, the girls in kid slippers, neat pantalettes, and tastefully plaited and ribboned hair. With his extended family and adult friends present to hear and applaud, John, honored to be chosen for special parts, soon discovered how much he liked reciting and speaking. Footnote. Having tasted the exhilaration of performing, the boy accompanied his brother, or Watson, to public forums addressed by white abolitionists or Black community leaders, witnessed the power of oratory to express ethical values and laudable goals, as well as to inspire protest and resistance. None ranked higher in the boy's pantheon of heroes during these months than 4 talented young Black orators: Joseph Henry Perkins, whom Peter H. Clark would call the great orator of the Ohio Valley; John I. Gaines, then barely in his 20s, but already active in state and local Black reform; Andrew J. Gordon; and Gideon Langston. In 1850, Frederick Douglass singled out both Perkins and Gaines for their great powers over the minds and feelings of our people. End quote, with a footnote. A barber noted for his dignity, Gordon was the speaker at a notable ceremony in 1845, after John had left the city, to honor Salmon Chase, presenting the attorney with an engraved silver pitcher in recognition of his contribution toward establishing a slave's right to freedom, if brought voluntarily by his owner to the state. Gordon praised not only Chase's service to the enslaved, but also his sensitivity to, quote, the deprivation of rights endured and the wrongs inflicted upon the free colored people, end quote. In return, the normally restrained Chase made his most radical utterance to date, a firm declaration of support for the Blacks' right to civil and political equity, including suffrage. Footnote. Although all of these fearless and able defenders of the rights of their people inspired John, his brother Gideon, who manifested large ability and learning with demanding and surprising qualities of oratory, excited his warmest admiration. Probably John was present on the brisk March 1843 evening when the gifted and eloquent Gideon, as Gaines characterized him, severely denounced colonization as having no other tendency than to sacrifice the free colored population for the purpose of rendering the system of slavery more secure. Abolition of slavery, Gideon declared, was the only means to achieve the entire liberation of the Black. A leader in the Black reform movement at the state level as well as in Cincinnati, Gideon was chosen in November 1843 to head the Black delegation that welcomed John Quincy Adams to the city. Privately, because Blacks were barred from participating in official welcoming ceremonies. In his remarks, Gideon, whom Adams described in his diary as a, quote, young mulatto son of wealthy Virginia planter, but bearing the name of Negress mother, unquote, expressed gratitude for the congressman's fight against slavery. Although we have no honors of state to confer, Gideon said, yet we offer you a far higher reward in the approbation of a grateful people. Injuries we write upon sand, but favors on marble, not to be erased. And these acts of yours are as indelibly written on the tablets of our hearts and can never be obliterated. End quote. The occasion provided John Langston with a proud family memory, and more poignant since Gideon had fallen victim to tuberculosis, apparently contracted after his exposure to severe winter weather because of his livery stable work. He was soon forced to drop from public life and died at the age of 46. What a loss, with a footnote. And I just want to stop here and express my surprise in the, I won't say the work of John Quincy Adams, but the being of John Quincy Adams. I only knew him as just another old white man who was the president of the United States of America. But I had no idea that he did what he did in the time in which he did it. It may not look like much now in the year 2019, but back in 1843, especially with the Amistad, I was not even aware, I didn't see the movie, but I wasn't aware that it was John Quincy Adams that defended Cinque. Nor am I sure of the pronunciation of his name as well. I need to look that up. But just wanted to stop here to note John Quincy Adams' work on behalf of African Americans and Africans. And I'm picking up on the second paragraph on page 56. Still in the second chapter. When the 13-year-old John left Cincinnati to return to Chillicothe in the spring of 1843, invitations from Woodson and Watson to stay with them whenever he might return helped soften his real regret at taking leave. Of Watson, at least, John had early news for the Baptist deacon offered. This is a quote, an impressive appeal to the throne of grace, unquote, at the Black State Convention in Columbus in August, attended by both John's brother Charles and his half-brother William Langston, delegates from Chillicothe. Indeed, in the fraternity of talent and need that developed between Black Ohioans, such meetings were inevitable. Growing into manhood, John Mercer Langston would maintain his ties with these men and their families, who had become, in a real sense, his own. In his maturity, he would express his gratitude to the outspoken leaders of the Black community, quote, all of whom it was the privilege and advantage of the boy John to hear and to know, their eloquent efforts serving him in large measure as inspiration and purpose. End quote. Footnote. His experience in Cincinnati had left him little ground to doubt that Black people, afforded half a chance, could earn their way and justify their claim to full citizenship rights in American society, and defend themselves by force of arms when appropriate to their struggle. The determination, sacrifice, and achievement exhibited daily by the reform-minded men and women with whom he had associated undergirded his future resolve to win them, at least, that half a chance. And this is the end of the second chapter of the book, Race and the City, about the city of Cincinnati, the Black history of the city of Cincinnati. And I do apologize for my hesitance and sometimes befuddled verbal expression of what I'm reading, simply because I am reading it for the very first time. So I may have the wrong intonation, with the periods and the commas, etc. But hopefully you can just go back and listen to it again and get a better understanding. Better yet, get the book, read it for yourself, for your own interpretation. But if the rest of these essays are anything like this first one that I have read, Chapter 2, about John Mercer Langston, this is eye-opening for me. Born and bred and raised in the city of Cincinnati, I never knew half of the stuff that I'm reading about right now. So I hope you don't mind my breaks in my reading, my expressions of wonder at what I'm reading, and I hope that you will share as well. And I really encourage you to get the book, because these footnotes, there are pages and pages of footnotes after this essay. I think there's probably as many pages for the footnotes as for the essay itself. But of course, if you do any research at all, you know that you do use a lot of the information that you gather just for your writing, but it's all right here. So there's no doubt whatsoever that these events took place. You can go back to the sources of the footnotes and read for yourself if those sources still exist. Hopefully some of them have been digitized, but it is proof that the information exists that was in this essay, especially the description of the riot of 1841. I know that there was a riot also in 1832 or so, and it would be interesting to see and research if the perspective of the riot can be given from the black point of view, and not just the white point of view, as we have here for the riot of 1841. So I encourage you to continue on with me as I read this book. You can listen to it as you're doing something that doesn't require a lot of mental strength, something that you're just doing absent-mindedly. You can listen as I read it to you, and I'd be happy to do so. God bless you. Bye-bye.